Chapter 25.
In the late afternoon, they strung a rope corral around the remuda so each hand could pick himself a set of mounts, each being allowed 4 picks. It was slow work, for Jasper Fant and Needle Nelson could not make up their minds. The Irishman and the boys had to take what was left after the more experienced hands had chosen. Augustus did not deign to make a choice at all. "I intend to ride old Malaria all the way," he said. "Or if not, I'll ride Greasy." Once the horses were assigned, the positions had to be assigned as well. "Dish, you take the right point," Call said. "Soupy can take the left, and Bert and Needle will back you up." Dish had assumed that as top hand he would have the point, and no one disputed his right, but both Bert and Needle were unhappy that Soupy had the other point. They had been with the outfit longer and felt aggrieved. The Spettle boys were told to help Lippy with the horse herd. Newt, the Rainies, and the Irishman were left with the drags. Call saw that each of them had bandanas, for the dust at the rear of the herd would be bad. They spent an hour patching on the wagon, a vehicle Augustus regarded with scorn. "That darn wagon won't get us to the Brazos," he said. "Well, it's the only wagon we got," Call said. "You didn't assign me no duties, nor yourself either," Augustus pointed out. "That's simple," Call said. "I'll scare off bandits and you can talk to Indian chiefs. You boys let these cattle string out," he said to the men. "We ain't in no big hurry." Augustus had ridden through the cattle and had come back with a count of slightly over 2,600. "Make it 2,600 cattle and 2 pigs," he said. "I guess we've seen the last of the darn Rio Grande. One of us ought to make a speech, Call. Think of how long we've rode this river." Call was not willing to indulge him in any dramatics. He mounted the mare and went over to help the boys get the cattle started. It was not a hard task. Most of the cattle were still wild as antelope and instinctively moved away from the horsemen. In a few minutes they were on the trail, strung out for more than a mile. The point rider soon disappeared in the low brush. Lippy and the Spettle boys were with the wagon. With the dust so bad, they intended to keep their horses a fair distance behind. Bolivar sat on the wagon seat, his 10-gauge across his lap. In his experience, trouble usually came quick. When it came, he meant to keep the 10-gauge handy to discourage it. Newt had heard much talk of dust, but he had paid little attention to it until they actually started the cattle. Then he couldn't help noticing it, for there was nothing else to notice. The grass was sparse, and every hoof sent up its little spurt of dust. Before they had gone a mile, he himself was white with it, and for moments actually felt lost, it was so thick. He had to tie the bandana around his nose to get a good breath. He understood why Dish and the other boys were so anxious to draw assignments near the front of the herd. If the dust was going to be that bad all the way, he might as well be riding to Montana with his eyes shut. He would see nothing but his own horse and a few cattle that happened to be within 10 yards of him. A grizzly bear could walk in and eat him and his horse both, and they wouldn't be missed until breakfast the next day. But he had no intention of complaining. They were on their way, and he was part of the outfit. After waiting for the moment so long, what was a little dust? Once in a while, though, he dropped back a little. His bandana got sweaty, and the dust caked on it so that he felt that he was inhaling mud. He had to take it off and beat it against his leg once in a while. He was riding Mouse, who looked like he could use a bandana of his own. The dust seemed to make the heat worse, or else the heat made the dust worse. The second time he stopped to beat his bandana, he happened to notice Sean leaning off his horse as if he were trying to vomit. The horse and Sean were both white, as if they had been rolled in powder, though the horse Sean rode was a dark bay. "Are you hurt?" he asked anxiously. "No, I was trying to spit," Sean said. "I've got some mud in my mouth. I didn't know it would be like this." "I didn't either," Newt said. "Well, we better keep up," he added nervously. He didn't want to neglect his responsibilities. Then, to his dismay, he looked back and saw 20 or 30 cattle standing behind them. They had ridden right past them in the dust. He immediately loped back to get them, hoping the captain hadn't noticed. When he turned back, two of the wild heifers spooked. Mouse, a good cow horse, twisted and jumped a medium-sized chaparral bush in an effort to gain a step on the cows. Newt had not expected the jump and lost both stirrups, but fortunately diverted the heifers so that they turned back into the main herd. He found his heart was beating fast, partly because he had almost been thrown and partly because he had nearly left 30 cattle behind. With such a start, it seemed to him that he would be lucky to get to Montana without disgracing himself. Call and Augustus rode along together, some distance from the herd. They were moving through fairly open country, flats of chaparral with only here and there a stand of mesquite. That would soon change. The first challenge would be the brush country, an almost impenetrable band of thick mesquite between them and San Antonio. Only a few of the hands were experienced in the brush, and a bad run of some kind might cost them hundreds of cattle. "What do you think, Gus?" Call asked. "Think we can get through the brush? Or had we better go around?" Augustus looked amused. "Well, these cattle are like deer, only faster," he said. "They'll get through the brush fine. The problem will be the hands. Half of them will probably get their eyes poked out." "I still don't know what you think," Call said. "The problem is I ain't used to being consulted," Augustus said. "I'm usually sitting on the porch drinking whiskey at this hour. As for the brush, my choice would be to go through. It's that or go down to the coast and get at by the mosquitoes." "Where do you reckon Jake will end up?" Call asked. "In a hole in the ground like you and me." "I don't know why I ever ask you a question," Call said. "Well, the last time I seen Jake, he had a thorn in his hand," Augustus said. "He was wishing he'd stayed in Arkansas and taken his hanging." They rode up on a little knobby hill and stood for a moment to watch the cattle. The late sun shone through the dust cloud, making the white dust rosy. The riders to each side of the herd were spread wide, giving the cattle lots of room. Most of them were horn stock, thin and light, their hides a mixture of colors. The riders at the rear were all but hidden in the rosy dust. "Them boys on the drags won't even be able to get down from their horses unless we take a spade and spade them off a little," Augustus said. "It won't hurt them," Call said. "They're young." In the clear late afternoon light, they could see all the way back to Lonesome Dove and the river and Mexico. Augustus regretted not tying a jug to his saddle. He would have liked to sit on the little hill and drink for an hour. Although Lonesome Dove had not been much of a town, he felt sure that a little whiskey would have made him feel sentimental about it. Call merely sat on the hill, studying the cattle. It was clear to Augustus that he was not troubled in any way by leaving the border or the town. "It's odd I partnered with a man like you, Call," Augustus said. "If we was to meet now instead of when we did, I doubt we'd have two words to say to one another." "I wish it could happen then, if it would hold you to two words," Call said. Though everything seemed peaceful, he had an odd, confused feeling at the thought of what they had undertaken. He had quickly convinced himself it was necessary, this drive. Fighting the Indians had been necessary. If Texas was to be settled, protecting the border was necessary, else the Mexicans would have taken South Texas back. A cattle drive, for all its difficulty, wasn't so imperative. He didn't feel the old sense of adventure, though perhaps it would come once they got beyond the settled country. Augustus, who could almost read his mind, almost read it as they were stopped on a little knob of a hill. "I hope this is hard enough for you, Call," he said. "I hope it makes you happy. If it don't, I give up. Driving all these skinny cattle all the way is a funny way to maintain an interest in life, if you ask me." "Well, I didn't," Call said. "No, but then you seldom ask," Augustus said. "You should have died in the line of duty, Woodrow. You know how to do that fine. The problem is you don't know how to live." "Whereas you do," Call asked. Most certainly, Augustus said. I've lived about 100 to your 1. I'll be a little riled if I end up being the one to die in the line of duty, because this ain't my duty and it ain't yours either. This is just fortune hunting. Well, we wasn't finding one in Lonesome Dove, Carl said. He saw Dietz returning from the northwest, ready to lead them to the bed ground. Carl was glad to see him. He was tired of Gus and his talk. He spurred the mare on off the hill. It was only when he met Dietz that he realized Augustus hadn't followed. He was still sitting on old Malaria, back on the little hill, watching the sunset and the cattle herd.